She celebrated when she saw her millionaire husband sick, but when the judge read the inheritance papers, Margaret Wilson could barely hide the smile that insisted on a peer at the corner of her lips. There was Richard Hampton, the wealthiest businessman in New York City, lying in that hospital bed, pale and fragile as she had never seen in their 15 years of marriage. It was when the doctor said he would need to stay hospitalized indefinitely that she felt a wave of relief wash over her body. Finally, she thought, clutching the handkerchief between her trembling hands, not out of sadness, but from a strange excitement. "Mrs. Hampton, are you all right?" asked Nurse Claire, who had noticed the wife's strange behavior. Yes, Mike, it's just the shock, you know how it is," Margaret replied quickly, trying to force a concerned expression. But Claire wasn't convinced. In her 20 years in the profession, she had never seen a wife react that way to serious news about her husband. There was something in the woman's eyes, a glint that didn't match the situation. Richard coughed softly in bed. His blue eyes that were once so penetrating now seemed dull. The 68-year-old businessman had built an empire with his own hands, rising from poverty in the outskirts of Queens to become owner of one of the largest construction companies in the country. "Margaret," he called in a weak voice. She approached, adjusting her brown hair that she always kept impeccable. "I'm here, my love," she said, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. I need to talk to Dr. Harrison about some papers," Richard murmured. Dr. Henry Mitchell had been the family lawyer for over 2 decades. Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. "Papers? What papers?" "Don't worry about that now. You need to rest," she replied, trying to sound caring. 3 hours later, when Richard finally fell asleep under the effect of medication, Margaret left the room with hurried steps. In the halls of Mount Sinai Hospital, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Hello, Frank." "Hi, love. How is he?" "Pretty bad. The doctors said it could take months to recover." "If he even recovers," she whispered, looking around to make sure no one was listening. Frank Miller was the man Margaret had been having a relationship with for 2 years. At 45, he was 15 years younger than her and worked as a personal trainer at a gym in the Upper East Side. "That means that—" "It means our plan might finally work," she interrupted. "But I need to be careful. His daughter might show up at any moment." Fiona Hampton, 32 years old, was Richard's daughter from his first marriage. There had always been tension between her and Margaret, especially after Richard remarried 5 years after being widowed. Margaret hung up the phone and returned to the room, where she found Richard awake, looking out the window that overlooked Fifth Avenue. "Where were you?" he asked. "I went to get some air. I was feeling a bit nauseous." She lied. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Even sick, there was still a sharp intelligence in those eyes that had closed millions in deals. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next day, Dr. Henry Mitchell arrived at the hospital carrying a brown leather briefcase. He was a man in his early 50s, thin, wearing glasses, with a serious manner that inspired trust. "Richard, how are you feeling?" he asked, greeting his friend. "I've been better." Richard tried to muster a smile. "Henry, I need to update my will." Margaret, who was arranging the flowers she had brought, dropped the vase. The water spread across the floor. "Sorry, how clumsy of me," she said, bending down to clean up the mess. "Margaret, would you give us a moment?" Richard asked gently. "Of course, I'll go downstairs for some coffee," she replied, but her voice betrayed contained irritation. As soon as she left, Richard turned to the lawyer. "Henry, I need to tell you some things I discovered about my wife." The lawyer settled into the chair next to the bed, opening his briefcase. "I'm listening." 3 months ago, I hired a private investigator. I always had a strange feeling about some of her behaviors, but I never wanted to believe it. Richard told how he had noticed that Margaret left the house at odd hours, always with excuses about Pilates classes or meetings with friends. How she had shown a sudden interest in the company's finances. How he had caught whispered phone conversations that stopped abruptly when he appeared. The investigator discovered that she is having a relationship with a certain Frank Miller. They have been meeting regularly for 2 years. Dr. Harrison shook his head sadly. He had seen many similar cases throughout his career. "There's more," Richard continued. "She opened a bank account in her name without informing me, and what hurt me the most, I found out she has been talking to other lawyers about asset division." "Richard, I'm so sorry. I know how much you loved her." "Loved is the right word," Richard sighed. "Henry, I want to make some changes to the will, but I want this done in a special way." Meanwhile, Margaret walked nervously through the hospital corridors. She had tried to listen to the conversation by pressing her ear against the door, but only managed to catch fragments. Words like will and changes made her extremely uneasy. She called Frank again. "They're talking about the will. I couldn't hear properly." "Calm down, love. You're his wife. Legally, you're entitled to half of everything." "I don't know. He's been acting very strange with me. What if he found out something?" "He couldn't have. We were super careful." But Margaret wasn't so sure. Richard had always been an extremely observant and intelligent man. He didn't get where he was by being naive. When she returned to the room, Dr. Harrison had already left. Richard was sleeping again, and she noticed some papers were on the nightstand. Curious, she approached slowly. They were sheets with the law firm's letterhead, but they were face down. Carefully, she tried to peek, but Richard opened his eyes. "You're back," he said, and there was something different in his voice. "How are you feeling?" she asked, trying to sound natural. "Thoughtful," Richard replied, watching her intensely. "Margaret, we need to talk." Her heart raced. "About what?" "About us. About our marriage. About many things." Margaret felt her legs go weak. He knew. Somehow Richard had found out about Frank. "I don't understand," she tried to stammer. "I think you do understand," Richard said calmly. "But for now, I'm very tired. Let's save this conversation for later." That night, Margaret could barely sleep. She had returned home to the penthouse in Soho that Richard had bought right after the wedding. Everything there screamed luxury, the imported furniture, the artwork, the Persian rugs, everything she had always dreamed of having. She paced back and forth in the living room, thinking about what to do. If Richard really knew about Frank, he could change the will to leave her with nothing, or worse, he could ask for a divorce. The phone rang. It was Frank. "So? Did you find out anything?" "He knows, Frank. I'm sure he knows." "How can you be sure?" "By the way he looked at me, by his tone of voice. Richard never was one for drama, but when he discovers something, he gets this look like he's analyzing the situation. And now? I don't know. I need to think." The next day, Margaret arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. She wanted to be there when the doctors made their morning rounds to show she was a devoted wife. Dr. Charles Montgomery, the cardiologist in charge of the case, was examining Richard when she arrived. "How is he, doctor?" she asked, forcing concern into her voice. "Stable, but we need to monitor him closely. What worries me is that he seems to be under some kind of emotional stress, which isn't good for his recovery." Margaret swallowed hard. Emotional stress. Of course he was. Finding out his wife was cheating on him wasn't exactly reassuring. "Doctor, is there anything I can do to help?" she asked. "Keep the environment calm. Avoid arguments or topics that might upset him." When the doctor left, Richard looked at her with an unreadable expression. "Margaret, sit down. It's time for our talk." She settled into the chair, her hands cold and sweaty. 15 years ago, when we met, I was a widowed, lonely man, trying to raise my teenage daughter alone. You appeared like a ray of sunshine in my life." Margaret remembered those early days. She had met Richard at a charity gala. She worked as an event planner, and he was one of the sponsors. Was it love at first sight? For her, maybe. For him, well, she was never sure. "I fell in love with you," Richard continued, "for your joy, for how you cared about Fiona, for the companionship you offered. I thought I had finally found someone to share my life with." His words cut like knives. Margaret knew he was speaking in the past tense. "Richard, let me finish," he interrupted, but gently. "In recent years, I started noticing changes, small things at first. Phone conversations that stopped when I entered the room. outings that became more frequent. Her sudden interest in my business affairs. She wanted to defend herself, explain, make excuses, but the words wouldn't come out. I hired a private investigator, Margaret. I know about Frank. Her world crumbled at that moment. All the lies, all the elaborate excuses, all the carefully laid plans, all down the drain. Richard, I also know about the bank account, about the conversations with lawyers, about the plans for when I was gone. Tears began to stream down her face, but not from remorse, from desperation. You're mistaken, she tried. I have photographs, Margaret, recordings, bank documents. There's no use denying it. Richard picked up an envelope from the bedside table and handed it to her. With trembling hands, Margaret opened it. Inside were photos of her and Frank entering and leaving motels, bank statements showing regular deposits she made into the secret account, even transcripts of phone conversations. Why? Was all Richard could ask. Richard could. The simple question caught her off guard. Why? Because she wanted financial security. Because Frank made her feel young again. Because she was never sure if Richard truly loved her or if she was just convenient company. I can't explain, she whispered. You may leave, please. I need to rest. Margaret left the room in a daze. In the hospital corridors, she called Frank, but he didn't answer. She called again and again. Nothing. Finally, a text message arrived. I need some time to think. Don't call me. She was alone. In the following days, the situation grew even more tense. Fiona Hampton arrived from a business trip to London, where she managed a branch of her father's company. Hi, Margaret, she greeted coldly upon meeting her at the hospital. Fiona had always been polite, but never warm with her stepmother. At 32, she was an independent woman with a degree in business administration and an MBA from England. She lived alone in an apartment in Greenwich Village and was in a serious relationship with an engineer. How is Daddy? She asked, entering the room. My daughter. Richard smiled when he saw her, and Margaret noticed it was his first genuine smile in days. I missed you. Fiona kissed her father's forehead. I was thinking maybe I should stay here for a while, to keep you company. Margaret felt another blow. If Fiona stayed, it would be harder to have private conversations with Richard, and who knew what else she might discover. No need to trouble yourself, Margaret said quickly. I'm taking care of everything. Fiona gave her a strange look. It's no trouble. He's my father. That afternoon, while Richard slept, Fiona and Margaret were alone in the room. The silence was awkward. Margaret, can I ask you a question? Fiona finally said. Of course. You've seemed different these past few days. Is there something going on that I should know about? Margaret felt her blood run cold. I don't understand. It's just, well, when someone in the family gets sick, we expect to see sadness, worry. But you seem, I don't know, restless. I am worried, obviously. Your father is my husband. Yes, I know, Fiona said, but her voice carried doubt. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That night, Margaret went home early. Fiona had offered to take the night shift at the hospital. Alone in the apartment, she tried to call Frank again, but the number was disconnected. Desperate, she decided to go to the gym where he worked. Equinox Fitness was closed, but she knew Frank sometimes stayed late doing private training sessions. There was a light on the first floor. She rang the bell several times until the door opened. Margaret! Frank seemed genuinely surprised to see her. We need to talk, she said, pushing the door to get inside. I don't think that's a good idea. Frank, Richard found out everything. He has pictures, recordings, everything. Frank ran his hand through his hair, nervous. I kind of figured this might happen. What do you mean? Margaret, you're not exactly discreet, and men like your husband don't get to where they are by being fools. So you already knew he could find out and you didn't warn me? I tried to warn you several times to be more careful, but you didn't want to listen. It was true. Frank had suggested they meet less often, that they be more discreet, but she always thought she had the situation under control. And now? She asked. Now we each go our separate ways, Frank replied bluntly. What do you mean? Margaret, what we had was good, but we always knew it was temporary. You're married, remember? But I thought that when Richard what? Frank interrupted her. When he died, were you really counting on that? The coldness in his voice shocked her. She had never thought about it in exactly those terms, but you were with me for his money too, she realized. I won't pretend that you being rich wasn't an attraction, Frank admitted. But I liked you, Margaret. I really did. It's just that now the situation has changed. Changed how? Your husband found out. You're going to be left with nothing, and I can't afford to get involved in a legal war with one of the most powerful men in New York City. Margaret left the gym, feeling completely lost. In a week, her entire life had fallen apart. Her husband had discovered the affair, her lover had abandoned her, and she was about to lose everything she had gained in the last 15 years. The next day, she arrived at the hospital to find Dr. Harrison talking with Richard again. This time, Fiona was also present. Margaret, Dr. Harrison greeted. Richard was telling me you had an important conversation. She just nodded, not trusting her own voice. How are the preparations going? Fiona asked the lawyer. What preparations? Margaret inquired. For the reading of the will, Richard replied calmly. But you're not... she stammered. No, I'm not dying, Richard said. But I thought it would be interesting to have a reading while I'm still alive. A sort of settling of accounts. Dr. Harrison opened his briefcase. It's unusual, but perfectly legal. Richard has decided to make his final wishes public while he's still lucid and present. But is this necessary? Margaret asked, a note of panic escaping in her voice. I think so, Richard replied, looking directly into her eyes. I think it's time for everyone to know exactly where they stand in my life. Dr. Harrison took some documents out of the briefcase. Let's begin then. Richard Hampton's will was updated last week and reflects his current wishes. Margaret felt her legs go weak. Fiona was holding her father's hand, clearly emotional but trying to stay strong. First, regarding movable and immovable property, Dr. Harrison began to read. The beach house in the Hamptons goes to Fiona Hampton, as well as the apartment in Greenwich Village that was already in her name. Fiona smiled, but clearly not because of the assets. It was because of her father's gesture of affection. The apartment in Soho, Dr. Harrison continued, and Margaret paid full attention, is available to Margaret Wilson Hampton for a period of 6 months, enough time for her to reorganize and find new housing. 6 months. Only 6 months in the home she had considered hers for 15 years. Regarding company shares, the lawyer went on, Fiona Hampton receives 60% of the shares. The other 40% will be divided among the company's long-time employees, ensuring they have a dignified retirement. Margaret was doing quick calculations in her head. The company was worth over $50 million. Fiona was becoming a multi-millionaire. And her? She wasn't being mentioned. As for the money in bank accounts and investments, Dr. Harrison continued reading, Richard Hampton designates 70% to an educational fund that will offer scholarships to underprivileged youth, 20% to Fiona Hampton, and 10% to social projects coordinated by Fiona. Wait, Margaret finally found her voice. And me? I'm his wife. I have legal rights. Dr. Harrison looked at Richard, who nodded for him to continue. Regarding Margaret Wilson Hampton, the lawyer read, Richard acknowledges that during the 15 years of marriage, she received a monthly allowance of $10,000, plus gifts, trips, and all expenses paid. He also acknowledges that she has a personal bank account with approximately $200,000, money saved from the monthly allowance. Margaret turned pale. How did he know about her secret account? Therefore, Dr. Harrison continued, Richard considers that Margaret has already received over the years the equivalent of approximately $2 million in various benefits. But that's not an inheritance, she protested. That was support during the marriage. Exactly. Richard spoke for the first time since the reading began. It was support. For 15 years you didn't work. didn't contribute financially to anything, lived a life of luxury at my expense, and as I recently discovered, used resources I provided to fund your parallel life. His words were like slaps to the face. Richard, I know I was wrong, but it's not over, he interrupted her. Dr. Harrison, continue. There is a special clause, the lawyer resumed reading. Richard Hampton offers Margaret Wilson Hampton one last opportunity. Margaret perked up. A chance? Maybe he still loved her. Maybe there was an opportunity for redemption. If Margaret agrees to participate in a volunteer work program for 2 years in social projects coordinated by Fiona, she will receive at the end of this period a sum of $100,000 and a letter of recommendation so she can rebuild her professional life. Volunteer work? She repeated, incredulous. Yes, Richard confirmed. Real work, helping people who truly need it. Maybe then you'll learn the value of things and people. And if I refuse? If you refuse, Dr. Harrison answered, you leave here with the clothes on your back and the $200,000 from your secret account. Margaret looked around the room. Fiona was looking at her with an expression that mixed pity and disapproval. Richard observed her calmly, as if analyzing a business decision. Harrison awaited her response with professional patience. I need time to think, she said finally. You have 24 hours, Richard replied. And Margaret, yes. Regardless of your decision, I want a divorce. That is non-negotiable. She left the hospital walking like a zombie. On the busy streets of New York City, she felt completely invisible. All those people passing by her, living their lives, and she there, at 48 years old, watching her existence crumble. She arrived home and threw herself on the Italian leather sofa that had cost a fortune. She looked around the luxurious apartment. In 6 months, none of that would be hers anymore. The phone rang. It was her sister, Vivian, who lived in Long Island. Hi, Marga, how is Richard? Margaret broke down crying. Between sobs, she told her sister everything. The illness, the discoveries, the will, the ultimatum. My God, Margaret, Vivian said at the end, what were you thinking? I don't know, she cried. I don't know what came over me. And this Frank? He disappeared, said he doesn't want to get involved in legal complications. That son of a bitch, Vivian growled. Margaret, listen here. You made a mistake, a big mistake, but you still have a chance. How so? Accept Richard's proposal. Go work on those social projects. Maybe you'll discover who you really are underneath all that greed. Volunteer work, Vivian. I've never worked a day in my life. I don't know how to do anything. Then learn. You're 48, not 80. There's still time to start over. After hanging up, Margaret kept thinking about her sister's words. Was there really still time to start over? Would she be able to support herself alone? That night she barely slept. She wandered around the apartment looking at every expensive object, every designer piece of furniture, every work of art. All of that had been her life for the past 15 years. But what was underneath all that luxury? The next morning she arrived at the hospital with a decision made. Richard was having breakfast when she entered. He looked a little better, with more color in his face. I've decided, she announced. I'm listening. I accept the volunteer work proposal. Richard studied her for a long moment. Are you sure? It won't be easy. It's hard work, with people in very difficult situations. You'll have to sweat, get dirty, sometimes put up with insults. I'm sure, she replied, though she wasn't sure of anything. Very well. Fiona will explain how it works. Fiona arrived an hour later and sat next to her father's bed. Daddy told me about your decision, she said to Margaret. I'll be honest, I didn't expect this. Neither did I, Margaret admitted. We have 3 main projects, Fiona explained. One is a community daycare in South Bronx. Another is a support center for the elderly in Williamsburg. And the third is a support house for women who are starting their lives over. A support house for women? Women who left abusive relationships, women who lost everything and need to start over, women who were abandoned. Finally, women in vulnerable situations. Margaret felt a strange pang in her chest. Wasn't she herself becoming a woman in a vulnerable situation? Where do I start? With the support house, Richard answered. You'll work directly with Helen Foster. who coordinates the project. 2 days later, Margaret was standing in front of a simple 2-story house in Williamsburg. The sign on the door said, "New Beginnings House, Support for Women." She took a deep breath and rang the bell. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The door was opened by a woman of about 50, with greying hair tied in a simple bun, wearing jeans and a cotton blouse. "You must be Margaret," she said with a smile. "I'm Helen. Come in." The house was simple, but clean and cozy. There were about 15 women of various ages in the living room, some talking, others reading, some caring for small children. "Girls," Helen clapped her hands, "this is Margaret, our new volunteer." Some women waved, others just looked on with curiosity. Margaret felt extremely out of place in her expensive clothes and jewelry. "First rule," Helen said quietly, "in here, everyone is equal. It doesn't matter where they come from or what they did before. Everyone is starting over." During the first few days, Margaret felt like a fish out of water. Her tasks included helping in the kitchen, organizing clothing donations, and watching the children while their mothers attended empowerment workshops. "Miss Margaret," a girl of about 6 called out, "can you help me with this puzzle?" Of course, Margaret sat on the floor next to the child. The girl's name was Sophia, and she was the daughter of Carla, a 28-year-old woman who had fled a violent marriage. "My mom said you used to be rich," Sophia said innocently. "I was," Margaret answered. "And now you're not?" "No." "Is it bad to be poor?" The simple question caught her off guard. Was it bad to be poor? She had always been terrified of poverty, but looking around, seeing women who had lost everything but still smiled, still cared for each other, still had hope. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I'm still learning." In the following weeks, Margaret began to learn the stories of the women in the house. There was Sandra, 42, who had been abandoned by her husband after 20 years of marriage and was left with nothing. There was Julia, 35, who lost everything in a financial scam. There was Rose, 55, who discovered her husband was maintaining 2 families. Each story was a mirror in some way. They had all trusted someone. They had all been betrayed or abandoned. They were all trying to start over. "Do you know the difference between you and them?" Helen asked one day as they prepared lunch together. "What?" "They didn't have a choice. They were victims of circumstances. You put yourself in the situation you're in." The observation was harsh, but fair. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," Helen continued. "I'm saying it because the first step to truly starting over is to take responsibility for your own actions." Margaret had thought a lot about that. Richard was right. She had lost herself in greed, in the desire to have financial security at any cost. But when had that started? When had she become that person? One afternoon, while helping Carla teach Sophia to read, the answer came. "Miss Margaret," Sophia asked, "why did you marry the rich man?" "Because," she began to answer automatically, "because I loved him," but stopped. "Because I thought he could give me security. Like my dad gave my mum?" Margaret looked at Carla, who was listening to the conversation. "No," Carla answered for her. "Your father was scary, not safe. Real safety is when you know you can take care of yourself." That phrase echoed in Margaret Wilson's mind for days. Real safety is when you know you can take care of yourself. She had never learned that. At 25, when she lost her parents, she quickly married the first man who came along with promises to take care of her. When that marriage ended badly, she went looking for another who could support her. And then came Richard Hampton. She had never tried to be independent. She had never discovered what she was capable of. "Helen," she said one day, "I'd like to learn to do more things. Useful things." "Like what?" "I don't know. Some skill that can help me support myself." Helen smiled. "How about starting with cooking? You have a knack for it." And so Margaret began to learn how to cook for real, not just heating up ready-made meals or following fancy recipes to impress guests, but home-cooked, nutritious, affordable food. Then came sewing. Rose, one of the women in the house, had been a seamstress all her life and offered to teach her. You have skillful hands, Rose said, watching Margaret make a hem. With practice, you could get very good at this. Little by little, Margaret was discovering herself. She discovered she enjoyed taking care of the children, that she had the patience to teach, that she could organize activities and events. You know something? Helen said one day. You should think about taking a course in education or social work. You think so? I do. You have a way with people, and with your experience here, you could work in social projects or education. The idea planted a seed in Margaret's mind. Going back to school at 48, why not? 3 months after starting volunteer work, she decided to visit Richard at the hospital. He was much better, already walking the halls. How are you? He asked upon seeing her. Different, she answered honestly. Richard, I need to apologize to you. You don't have to. Yes, I do, not just for the betrayal, for all those years when I wasn't a real wife, when I only thought of myself. Richard studied her for a moment. And now, what do you plan to do? Finish the 2 years of volunteer work, and then I want to go to college. I want to get a degree in some field that will let me keep helping people. Really? Very much so. I discovered I like to work. I like to be useful. I like knowing I can support myself with my own effort. Richard smiled, and for the first time in months it was a genuine smile directed at her. I'm happy to hear that. Richard? Yes? Can you forgive me? Not so we can be married again, I know that won't happen, but so we can have peace. Richard thought for a long moment. I can, he said finally. In fact, I already have. Holding on to anger only hurts the one holding it. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Thank you. When she left the hospital that day, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. She walked to New Beginnings House, where she now spent most of her days. How was the visit? Helen asked. Good, very good. And the plans for college? I'm thinking about education, actually. I want to work in social education. You'll need money for the tuition. I've already thought about that. I'm going to sell my designer shoes and handbags. I have a collection worth about $50,000. It's enough to pay for college and still have some left over for expenses. Helen laughed. Who would have thought? The woman who arrived here all done up is now planning to sell her bags to pay for college. Life takes some turns, doesn't it? A year later, Margaret was in her second semester of the education program at Pace University. She had sold almost all her jewelry and designer clothes, keeping only a few basic items. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Williamsburg, near New Beginnings House, where she continued to volunteer in her spare time. Mrs. Wilson! Sophia, now 7 years old, ran to hug her when she arrived at the house. My mother got a job. Carla was beaming. She had managed to get a job as a receptionist at a medical office. I'm so proud of you, Margaret hugged her. You know something? Carla said. It was you who inspired me. Me? How? Seeing you start over from scratch. If a 48-year-old woman can go back to college and learn to make it on her own, I can too. Margaret felt her eyes well up. She had never imagined she could be an inspiration to anyone. That afternoon she received a call from Fiona. Hi, Margaret, how are you? Well, and your father? Great. He's back at work, but now on reduced hours. Margaret, I have a proposal for you. I'm listening. How about coordinating a new project of ours? A support house specifically for women over 40 who need to restart their lives. Margaret was silent for a moment. Would it be a paid job? Of course. Coordinator's salary, compatible with your experience and ongoing education. Fiona, why are you doing this? Because Helen told me how you've grown, because all the women at New Beginnings House rave about your work, and because I think Dad would be proud. And does he know about this proposal? It was his idea. Margaret had to lean against the wall. Richard had thought of her to coordinate a project. Can I give you an answer later? Of course. Think it over. That night, Margaret sat on the small balcony of her apartment drinking tea. The view was no longer Fifth Avenue, but a small inner courtyard of the building where some children were playing. She thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 years. Richard's illness, the discoveries, the loss of everything, the volunteer work, college, the new friendships, the hard-won independence. She thought of Frank, who had completely disappeared from her life. She had heard by chance that he had moved to Miami. Strangely, she felt nothing for him anymore. It was as if the person who had been involved with him was another Margaret, from another time. She thought of Richard, who had forgiven her and was now offering a professional opportunity. She thought of Fiona, who had overcome the differences of the past. And she thought of herself. At 49, she was discovering who she really was beneath all the masks she had worn throughout her life. The next day, she called Fiona. "I accept the proposal," she said simply. "That's great. When can you start?" "I need to finish the semester at college. How about we start planning the project and I officially take over in January?" "Perfect." 2 weeks later, Margaret was sitting in the conference room of Richard's company, attending a presentation about the new project. New Beginnings House 40 Plus, Fiona explained to the social investors, will focus specifically on women over 40 who need to rebuild their professional and personal lives. Richard was present, seated at the head of the table. When his eyes met Margaret's, he smiled and nodded slightly. "The project coordinator will be Margaret Wilson," Fiona continued, "who brings a unique experience. She herself went through the process of restarting her life at 48. After the meeting, Richard approached Margaret. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," she admitted, "but excited. It will all work out. You have something no other coordinator could have. You know exactly what these women are going through." "Richard? Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. For giving me the chance to start over. For forgiving me. For believing in me." "You don't need to thank me. You earned it." He made a move to leave, but she called him back. "Richard?" "Yes." "Are you happy?" The question seemed to catch him by surprise. "You know I am." "I am. I'm happier now than I've been in years." "Even after everything you've been through?" "Especially after everything I've been through. I found out who the people are that really care about me. I found out I can use my money for things that really matter. And I found out that forgiving sets the forgiver free." "And is there someone special in your life?" Richard smiled. "There is. A very interesting widow I met in a cooking class for seniors. Her name is Barbara." Margaret smiled too. It was strange, but she felt genuinely happy for him. "I'm happy for you. And you, is there someone?" "No," she answered. "And that's okay. I need to learn to be okay with myself before I share my life with someone else." Wise decision. 6 months later, New Beginnings House 40 Plus was running at full steam. Margaret had graduated with honors in education and started a postgraduate degree in social work. The project served 25 women, offering not just temporary housing, but vocational courses, psychological support, and guidance for re-entering the job market. "Margaret?" called Vivian, her sister, who had come from Long Island to visit the project. "I'm so proud of you. Thank you for not giving up on me back then. I knew that underneath all that greed there was a good person, just a little lost." That afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected visit. It was Frank. "Hi," he said, standing in the doorway of the house. "Hi," she answered, surprised but calm. "I heard you were working here. I came to apologize." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. I abandoned you when you needed support the most. It was cowardly of me." Margaret watched him for a moment. He was still handsome, still had the charm that had attracted her, but she was waiting to feel something, and she felt nothing. "Frank, you did what you thought was best for you, I understand." "Margaret, I'd like to try again, with you." She shook her head, smiling. "No, Frank. That Margaret doesn't exist anymore. And honestly, I don't think you'd be interested in the woman I am today." "Why?" "Because now I don't have money. I can't pay for your gym, expensive clothes, dinners at fancy restaurants. Now I'm a working woman, independent, who shares an apartment with a college friend to save money. Frank was at a loss for words. "But I can tell you one thing," she continued. "I am much happier now than I ever was when I had all that." After he left, Margaret went back to her activities. There was a lecture on female entrepreneurship to give to the women of the house. "Girls," she said to the group gathered in the room, "today we're going to talk about how to turn a skill into a source of income." Rose, the seamstress who had become one of her best friends, raised her hand. "Margaret, you could tell your story, how you left a life of luxury and managed to reinvent yourself." The other women agreed enthusiastically. "All right," Margaret said, sitting down among them. "But you have to promise you'll pay attention not just to the mistakes I made, but to the lessons I learned." And she began to tell. She told about the years of dependency, about the betrayal, about the fear of having nothing, about the first days of volunteer work when she didn't even know how to make a simple meal. "What changed?" asked one of the women. "I found out that security doesn't come from how much money you have, but from knowing you are capable of taking care of yourself. I found out that working isn't humiliation, it's dignity. And I found out that helping others is the best way to heal our own wounds." "And do you regret it?" asked another. "Losing all that wealth?" Margaret thought for a moment. "You know what? Of course it was more comfortable to have money, but I was an empty, unhappy person, living in constant fear of losing everything. Now I know that if I lose everything again, I can start over again, and that gives me a peace that no money can buy." 2 years later, at the graduation ceremony of the first class of New Beginnings House 40+, Margaret was on the makeshift stage in the garden of the house. "When we started this project," she said to the audience, which included the graduates, their families, Richard, Fiona, and several supporters, "I thought I was here to teach. I discovered I was here to learn." The 25 women of the first class were all employed or had their own businesses running. Sandra had opened a bakery. Julia was working as an accountant in a small office. Rose had set up a sewing workshop. "Each of you taught me something," Margaret continued. "You taught me that strength isn't about never falling, it's about always getting back up. You taught me that starting over isn't about going back to what you were before, it's about becoming someone better." After the ceremony, Richard approached. "Congratulations," he said. "I'm very proud of what you've built here." "Thank you. And how is Barbara?" "Very well. In fact, we're getting married next month." "How wonderful. I'm very happy for you." "Margaret?" "Yes?" "I'd like you to be at the ceremony. As a friend." She was moved. "It would be an honor." 3 weeks later, Margaret was at the wedding of Richard and Barbara, an elegant 62-year-old lady, a widow, a retired teacher, with a warm and genuine smile. "Nice to meet you," Barbara said as she greeted her. "Richard has told me a lot about you and the wonderful work you do. Thank you, you make a beautiful couple." "You know," Barbara said, lowering her voice, "he told me your whole story. I want you to know that I hold no resentment. On the contrary, I really admire the way you rebuilt your life." During the party, Margaret danced, talked, laughed. She was wearing a simple dress she had bought at a popular store, but she felt more beautiful than she had ever felt in her designer clothes. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Fiona approached. They went out to the club's garden. "Margaret, I have a proposal." "Another one?" she laughed. "The New York City Mayor's office wants to replicate the New Beginnings House 40+ model in other areas of the city. They want you to coordinate the entire project." "Really?" "Very serious. It would be a position in the Social Services Department. Excellent salary, career plan, chance to impact thousands of women." Margaret was speechless. "I need an answer by next week," Fiona continued. "But I want you to know this opportunity exists because you proved that it is possible to start over, no matter your age." A week later, Margaret was on her last day as coordinator of New Beginnings House 40+. She would take up the position at the mayor's office the following Monday. "You'll be missed," said Helen, who had become a great friend. "I'll keep coming here whenever I can. This place changed my life. And you changed a lot of people's lives too." That night, alone in her apartment, Margaret looked in the mirror. At 51, she had some grey hairs she no longer dyed, wrinkles she didn't hide with Botox, hands that showed the hard work of recent years, and she was more beautiful than she had ever been. Her life now fit in a 2-bedroom apartment, but it was full of purpose. Her bank account had fewer zeros, but her heart was full of gratitude. Her schedule no longer included parties and spas, but it was filled with meaningful projects. The phone rang. It was Sophia, now 10 years old. "Aunt Margaret, my mum said you're going to work at the mayor's office." "Yes, I am, sweetheart." "Does that mean you're important?" "No, Sophia." "So you're saying I have the chance to do important things?" "What's the difference?" "The difference is that being important is about how others see you. Doing important things is about how you help make the world better." After hanging up, Margaret Wilson went to the kitchen to prepare some tea. As the water boiled, she thought about everything she had lost: the mansion, the cars, the jewels, the social status, the marriage, and about everything she had gained: independence, purpose, true friendships, inner peace, the certainty that she could trust herself. Was it worth it? Every tear, every moment of despair, every day of hard work, every night of uncertainty? Absolutely. Because for the first time in her life, at 51 years old, Margaret Wilson knew exactly who she was, and she really liked the woman she saw in the mirror. End of story. And you? What did you think of Margaret's journey? Have you ever experienced a fresh start in life? Leave your thoughts about this story of overcoming in the comments, and tell us where you're following us from. Do you believe it's never too late to start over? We'd love to hear about your experience. Thank you for your company, and don't forget to like and subscribe.